I'll subject you to me for 2 or 3 in a row, which is rather tedious. So, again, okay, so what we're going to do this time is we've looked at some of the physics, we're going to go into impacts, other issues, politics, and we're going to look at the framework convention documents. Okay, so yes.
Can we ask just kind of a review question of last time? Maybe.
I don't have to answer it. That's no problem.
Fair enough. But you're going to ask kind of if you could just briefly talk about more of the big conclusions real quickly, just kind of sum them up again. I know that the change in distribution of rainwater, kind of those types of like the major things.
You want the major things? We've ravaged the planet. We're going to go, we're going on a deep slope, whatever, perdition. I mean, the question is, what are the main climate change issues? Are they clearly you have seen evidence of climate change on almost all scales, from ice retreat, snow here, whatever. Some of them may be caused by greenhouse gases, some may not. The bulk of them clearly are consistent with greenhouse gases, and many of them have been directly attributed as they must be greenhouse gases as opposed to anything else. When you get down to smaller scales, it's not. When you're talking about predictions of the future, once again, you can see a higher likelihood of certain things being more robust. The large shape climates warm more than oceans. The northern climates warm the most. Okay, those are fairly robust across all models. And then you go to look at rainfall, and you find that they don't always agree on where it's getting wetter or drier. Large typical areas, if you group them by areas like Mediterranean regions, almost everybody agrees that on average, all the Mediterranean regions on average are getting drier. Somebody might not get the Caribbean getting drier, but they get the other part. So if you look for patterns for types of climate shifts, they tend to be more robust when you're looking at them. Details, of course, get fuzzier as you go farther out. Uncertainties get larger at 2100 because the climate change is larger. And we're going into a realm we don't have any observational analogs for. So we'll hit that again because now we're going to talk about in terms of what that's doing to the impacts. So we're going to try to look at more impacts issues. First, however, we should look at the whole process of what's going on. We focus more on a bit of the issue of the IPCC. Let's back up to the Framework Convention documents, okay, what's really in them, because they determine a lot about the fights you see, the newspaper articles you see, and what's going on in public battles are. So this is a fairly simple document. It was written in 1992, 2 years after the Rio one, okay. It was finally ratified in 94, okay. And so what you have is a whole series of things. I'll do this one quickly, okay. So you begin with the Framework Convention, and you have parties to this convention. Oops. Okay. You have parties to this convention. Well, that's what the parties are. The parties are the parties to the convention. Okay, they are governmental only. Sometimes there are weird things like EU counts as a party sometimes because it's a collection of governments and what's a uniform government or not. But in general, you don't have. There's nobody who's a party to the convention who's not a government. You don't have World Wildlife Friends, whatever, Friends of the European Party. What do these things begin with? They begin with a whole bunch of nice little boilerplate things. So acknowledging this, concerned that, noting this, aware of, noting, acknowledging, and so on. There are pages of this. Some of the interesting ones are the beginning ones, okay? They're fairly straightforward. So the idea that there's concern that human activities have changed climate, have increased greenhouse gases, and that the increase in greenhouse gases will result in warming. So this is 92. The warming has been debatably detected by some people, not by others. It's whether or not the planet's really warming in 92. There's still some issue. This is a fairly clear statement. It's making no assumptions other than if you put the physics in, this is what you get. So it does have causality. It does say we are responsible for a lot of the increase in greenhouse gases. We're concerned about that, and then we're concerned that those increase in greenhouse gases will then drive climate change. So that sort of says in a nutshell what they're after, or at least what the facts are. The other one, however, the one after it's more loaded. Noting a larger share of historical and current global emissions of greenhouse gases originated in developed countries. Okay, this blame game. Who's responsible? Who's done it so far? Okay. Now this is historical. Historical means even before people knew that climate change was an issue. So it's an interesting issue. Okay, blame game. But this leads to what you will see later is common but differentiated goals. This means that the developed countries get the blame and therefore have the responsibility for fixing and paying reparations. The developing countries are claiming innocence on this one. You will see that over and over again. You saw it in Copenhagen last year. You'll see it again in Cancun this year. Okay, this is sort of the core issue, and it's not exactly true anymore. It's getting still, the question is how do you integrate past emissions and how do you, so anyhow, this is sort of the issue that drives a lot of the problems in the UN negotiations. It's basically true at this point, yeah.
So if developed countries are to blame and have responsibility for fixing things,
Yeah.
are there ways to keep developing countries accountable to make sure they don't follow the same path?
This is a good question, and you will see that the developing countries argue they shouldn't have any responsibilities until their time comes and they're developed. This is all a negotiating tool. Okay, there's nothing in here. There's nothing in this document that pertains to developing countries.
Okay.
It pertains to them, but nothing that has any responsibilities in developing countries. So this document accepts that the Framework Convention to start with is of interest to all nations, but it's really written by the developed countries. It's really prepared by, and even admit that, this is straightforward, saying, what is it we're supposed to do? So let's go through and look at responsibilities. Okay, so we have awareness, acknowledging, or recalling the persistence, the pertinent provisions of the Declaration of the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. Everybody puts in remember back, okay. Now these were particularly, where your page down, it's the page down, okay. Applied some countries, recalling. We have a little run over the page, noting the Ministerial Declaration of the World Climate Conference. See, the Second World Climate Conference in 1990 started pushing this. Okay, recognizing steps, okay. Recognizing, affirming, recognizing, have agreed as follows. Okay, we're down there finally, okay. Have agreed as follows, okay. Now, this is just a prelude. This begins the articles. And so when people refer to the convention, they say article something. So everybody knows it's almost like a quick thing. It was, article 3.2, remember that one. And if you're in the government using this, you know what the articles are, you don't worry about them. But article 1's all definitions, so it's not too much. It does define something. Oh, how did I do there? I don't know. Come on. Please, where's article? There we go. Okay. Definitions are important. Two of them are obvious here, but some of them is difficult. The second one's more obvious. Greenhouse gases are those gases constituents, both natural and anthropogenic, so they're natural greenhouse gases that absorb and re-emit infrared radiation. It's a fairly simple scientific definition of what makes a greenhouse gas. Okay, that's the criteria. We found that when we were doing working group 1. Greenhouse gases trap radiation, infrared radiation, because that's the earth shine that cools. So they define greenhouse gas, they even define emissions, but moreover they define climate change, and this is an oddity. Okay? Note the definition of climate change in the Framework Convention. Okay? It is different from climate change in the science uses and IPCC uses. Okay? Climate change for a scientist means a statistical shift in the weather patterns, or the weather statistics, which is the climate. So you have to say, is this decade different from that decade? You say, well, they both vary, they're a little different, or is the difference large enough to basically constitute a climatic shift or not, or is it within the noise level? You say any decade they're going to bounce around this small level. So detecting climate change is a fairly detailed, tough measurement about what statistics you use, what you go after, what you can make measurements of, and you can sort of compare one decade to another, sort of that scale. Climate change from the Framework Convention has a very specific meaning. It's human only. Okay. Attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. Okay. So when you read the IPCC documents, you will see a note in front of the SPM saying, no, our definition of climate change refers to all climate change, whether natural, anthropogenic, forced or unforced, that we detect a shift in climate patterns. The Framework Convention uses it only for anthropogenic. So everybody writes their own little prologue on it and notes the differences, okay? It's not a big deal, but you'll just find a little bit of warnings and footnotes everywhere. The reason is for convenience. Framework Convention people weren't trying to overrule define climate change. They wanted to make sure when they talked about climate change in the convention and climate change ever, they were referring to anthropogenic without having to constantly put human caused anthropogenic or whatever. So it's sort of a convenience. The Climate Change Convention is referring to anthropogenic climate change only. So that's a minor detail, but you'll see it basically has greenhouse gases. The titles include those articles. Any more of this? Okay. So finally, hit Articles 2 and 3. 3 has some interesting stuff in it, but 2 is the ultimate one. It's a very nice. It's a short one. It's only one paragraph long. Okay. And so anybody who does things, everybody knows what Article 2 is, and they'll say, does this support of Article 2? And so Article 2 is something even I've learned that one. Article 3, I can't remember what 3.1 versus 3.2 is and whatever. Some have to do with how you count greenhouse gases, whether it's land use change issues and things like that. But Article 2 is the objective. Okay. Now, in the middle of that is the key words, which is prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Okay. That's the key words. That's the primary. That's the objective of the entire convention. Okay. And then we have a little bit of warning at the beginning. Okay. Any related legal instruments the conference parties may adopt, And then it says within a time frame for ecosystems, sustainability, and everything else. So it says you don't do it at all cost. It's reminding you that climate change is within a lot of other problems. But the core is those middle sentences, that middle phrase, prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Okay. The other one is the top part, begins also as an objective, talks about other legal instruments. That's the Montreal Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is another legal instrument under this framework convention. Okay, so it's setting up to have those other legal instruments that might exist under the convention itself. So this one is basically everything you need. My estimate is it may have taken probably several days of a whole group of people trying to draft that and work it over. It's quite clean. There's no glitches in it. When I read science documents, you go, oh, they didn't have to say that, a waste of words. You know, there's misinterpretation. This one's hard to misinterpret. It's hard to, every time you read it, it's not prone to misinterpretation. It's not vague, okay? Every word counts. Yeah, we should write so well as this every time we write a paragraph for our papers, okay? It's fairly clean and to the point. But again, my guess is it probably took about, a dozen or more delegates working several days in a sidebar, editing, fixing, bringing it up to plenary to get this stuff done. I'm curious to see how it works. Principles, okay. Principles are nice. If you don't do the principles, you don't get penalized. This is a framework convention. This is not a protocol, so the penalties and whatever are zero on this. This is, the goal is to have these principles. Doesn't mean you have to do them. Okay, protect the climate system for the benefit of future generations, present and future generations, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities, right? Buried in that open one is the common but differentiated responsibilities is a phrase you hear over and over again. That means that the developed world has the responsibility for fixing the problem. That's what, and that the developing world has some responsibilities to allow the problem to be fixed and to support the developing countries. Okay, but that's what common but differentiated responsibilities language means.
Is there a definition for developed and developing?
It's vague here, but there's Annex 1, which is the OECD listed explicitly here. Those are the countries responsible. And Annex 2 is everything but the Russian states. Those are the ones who have to support it with the money. So you'll see listed in the convention who they regard as developed, which will be Annex 1. Now, it's not necessarily given a new country could you define what's developed or not, but it literally labels those countries who are in Annex 1 who have the responsibility to develop. And then there's Annex 2, which are the ones who actually pay for this. Like pay for all the conventions, pay for the developing countries to come. There's a trust fund that has to be paid for, so the developing countries don't even have to pay to attend these meetings. Okay. This is a good sinecure if you need it. I mean, it's good for collect per diem, people show up at these meetings. IPCC meetings, we get a lot of foreign people showing up who are not scientists who've been appointed by their governments. They just sort of show up once, opening meeting, and they disappear for 5 days. And then, go home. Some of it's really weird. Some of it, no. There's a lot of good stuff. Foreign scientists that work on this, but some countries just send someone to show up, to even the IPCC meetings, much less these meetings, which are huge. Yeah.
I just have to ask, are China and India Annex 1 countries?
Oh, you can answer that one. Okay, that's too easy. You'll see. Okay. So we have common but differentiated responsibilities. Okay. And we have precautionary measures. Parties should take precautionary measures to anticipate whatever. Okay. So these are principles that they're looking for. You have sustainable developments listed. Promote sustainable developments, recognized as part of it. Okay. And then we have actual commitments. So the principles are fairly general. Anybody who signs on is supposed to have those principles, but that's vague. Then we have commitments. And commitments are a little tougher. The only real commitments we have are reporting, and then there's one down the bottom that says promote sustainable management of resources and try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but doesn't say by how much. The national reporting inventories is the only real requirement that the government's accepted by signing on to this, and that's all governments, but the developing countries have to, the developed countries, the OECD has to do it every other year, whereas the developing countries have to do it once in 15 years or once in 10 years or something like that. So national reporting from countries other than the OECD, I think there's one report on a random year that every country's put in, basically on greenhouse gas emissions. But from the OECD and the developing countries, this has sort of been a major basis of getting reporting done right, figuring out if we actually can monitor, shall we say, measure and report greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's one of the requirements of the convention, not the protocol, but the convention. It's probably the only real commitment that governments have taken on as responsibility for joining. So greenhouse gas national inventories are the key issues. Notice that it says, sorry, I circled it, of anthropogenic emissions. If you don't think it's anthropogenic and it's coming out of your country, it's not your responsibility, you don't report it. So once again, it's not necessarily reporting all the CO2 coming out of the country, it's reporting what you are held accountable for by various processes. And there are rules for whether it's anthropogenic or not, but it doesn't mean the total amount of emissions, it means the amount of emissions that you are categorized by activity and process as supposed to be reporting. So it's anthropogenic, not all emissions. Okay, I love this one. Take climate change considerations into account to the extent feasible in their relevant social, economic, and environmental policies and actions. Most countries since the 90s have done nothing on this until they got to the Kyoto Protocol. Certainly our government signed on it, never took any climate change action or whatever. It's interesting. Again, there's no teeth in the convention. The reporting they took seriously, this article they didn't bother with, really. I mean, it's a vague enough one, you could say you always met those requirements. Let's see, promote exchange property, here we go. Relevant technical advice, social economic, climate system change, okay. This says it's supposed to be an open process for the knowledge exchange, okay. So there's a general subsidiary body for science and technology stuff. There's a subsidiary body for implementation of the Framework Convention. These deal with interfacing with the science community and whatever. The Framework Convention doesn't interface directly with the science community or whatever else. They have groups of them, subsets of them that meet regularly and sort of filter the science through the IPCC and whatever. So the IPCC actually reports, for example, to one of the subsidiary bodies, which meets concurrently. We'll look at that. Okay. I can't page that. Okay. Okay. Here we go. The developed countries and parties in Annex 1 shall commit themselves to the following. Okay. Each parties adopt national policies. Okay. This is projected anthropogenic emissions by sources, removal, sinks of greenhouse gases, so saying what you're supposed to reporting. And then it says with the aim of returning individually to the 1990 levels, and so on. So they're going to be reporting inventories. The goal is to return to 1990 levels. Kyoto Protocol is below 1990 levels. The goal here is to return to them, but once again, this is a convention, it has no teeth, and these are sort of general principles or goals, but they're not requirements. But that's set up 1990. It's set up 1990 as the base reference date, which has caused problems ever since because we really don't know what governments were doing in 1990. Let's see, oops, oh, well, that's good. I haven't done that one, okay. Sorry. Acrobat's not as swift as some other things, especially when you throw a button. Okay. This is a worry about what the climate change issue is, adverse effects of climate change. So most of this is low-lying countries, small islands, sea level rise, arid deserts, forests, liable to forest decay. This has to do with drought and other things. Issues of change in water supply, natural disasters. I don't know what that means. Countries there is prone to natural disasters, or the weather, or the earthquakes. It's sort of a little vague. Okay. Areas of high urban pollution. This is just warning that the adverse effects of climate change may be unfairly. Landlocked and transit countries. Okay, I don't know what that one has to do with it, but it's a warning. Support and develop international government intergovernmental programs, networks, defining, assessing. This sort of is like pointing towards IPCC in some sense. Okay. There's an education, training, public awareness, and then it sets up conference of the parties. This defines what it is. These are the people who sign on and ratify this. They become the conference of the parties. So it defines what they are, defines what they should be doing, periodically examine, hold meetings, okay, among other things. So it gives the responsibilities for the conference of the parties. And then it invokes the fact that anybody can attend, anybody can apply to attend the conference of the Framework Convention meetings or the conference of the parties meetings, okay, national, international, governmental, or non-governmental. Okay, body or agency. That doesn't mean you personally can, but you can create some sort of climate org, NGO, and then declare yourself to be one, and then apply to attend as a non-governmental organization. So anybody can ask to send their credentials in and go. I've gone to a couple of meetings, and either I've gone as IPCC, which is intergovernmental, it's international and intergovernmental, it has its own. And another time I've gone for reporting, I've been a member of some business organization, which was an NGO attending because I was supposed to give a talk and you'd have somebody sponsor you. Okay. So it depends. As I said, some, San Diego and Stanford set up an NGO so they could attend, so they could send students over to recent COP or whatever, effectively. So literally anybody can go. These meetings must be public. Not all the meetings are public. Sometimes the meetings are closed doors. You can't get in without a government badge. Sometimes you can't get in without the right government badge. So if G77 in China are having a meeting, you have to have the right government badge to get in. Somebody watches the door, the US can't sneak in. Other times, literally, you have to have a government badge to get in some of the meetings, and they'll close off usually the last week of the conference. The parties will be I'll show you, fairly tight. But anybody can officially attend, hold booths outside, request space for that. Secretariat's established. Okay, now there's both an important and a boondoggle. This is a large sink of money because it sets up a huge secretariat to run an operation with people and whatever. Okay. Subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. Again, this is the body that brings in IPCC and other related issues. They'd be the ones discussing. Implementation would be the body. There's another one. Let's see, I mentioned this one. Prepare scientific assessments, the effective measures taken on implementing and so on. And then we have the implementation body, and that literally is, how do you actually implement it? How do you get countries to agree to fill out the spreadsheets, do the reporting? How's it done? What are the rules? Okay. Financial mechanism, who pays for it? Okay. And with climate, it's not really talking about climate damage so much as it gets into that, but a lot has to do with who pays for it. Communication, okay, getting rid of boring. Settlement of disputes, that one. Amendments, how do you amend it? Okay. Adoption. Amendments and annexes. Protocols, Article 17. That tells you about the protocols. It's not an amendment to the Constitution, to the Convention, it's actually a separate protocol. So in this case, we have the Kyoto Protocol under the Convention, which we'll look at. Right to vote, who gets to vote? Each party have one vote. Things are usually never decided quite by vote, so they can be, okay. Depository, Secretary General of the UN shall adopt this as adopted according to Article 17. Signature, shall be open for signature, basically in New York, for 2 years or whatever, the year following. Okay, I guess they gave you 1 year from June 20th to June 19th. And then there's the rule on what does it mean to ratify, accept, approve, or access. These are different governmental terms the U.S. ratifies. It's what you do with international treaties, and our government has different terms. You have to do one of them. The convention was signed by the executive branch when it was done at the convention. The government's all signed. Then it has to go back to be ratified, accepted, approved, accessed, and so on. So it'll get signed. Kyoto Protocol was signed by Gore and Company in Kyoto. Then it came back here and had to be ratified. Entry into force, okay? This is typical. Kyoto Protocol has its 50th instrument of ratification, acceptance, approval, or accession. I love that catchy phrase since everybody has different terms, okay? Okay, so we need 50 governments to sign on, then it goes into effect, and you say we actually have a conference of the parties, and we go. Reservations, withdrawals, done, boom. Okay. So this is Annex 1. Annex 1 is reporting greenhouse gases. That's the only major requirement in Annex 1. Okay, so we go from Australia down to US. Okay, and you note that there's little A's. The A's are economies in transition as a euphemism for former Soviet states that broke up. Okay, so those still have reporting requirements. How well they do is pretty bad. Russia's reporting is pretty miserable. Okay, and then that's the federal, not Soviet Union, just Russia itself is pretty bad. And so we have the rest of the countries. These are Annex 1. They're meant to be reporting. Originally it was the OECD, because that was the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. The Paris Organization, it's literally the developing countries. Okay. Now, then there's Annex 2. It's the economies in transition. That's a euphemism. Annex 2 is financial aid. These are the countries that pay for it, basically. And they support it. Okay, and you notice the Soviet states are not there at all. It's basically everybody else. So, those are the only ones mentioned, and that is about it. So in 2001, I once looked. This is from the UN Framework Conventions, who's ratified it. And so if you go look at this, you say, okay, this is as of 2001. This went into effect in 1994 after 50 governments ratified, accessed, or whatever, okay? Legislative ratification. And so you have the signature is 92, almost all of them were signed when it was written. Some people signed a little later, that's the executive branch signing. The next one, ratification, is the one that counts. And then entry into force is when it entered into force here. So let's see. Most of this went into force in 94, but you see Angola didn't ratify until 17th of May, and therefore it went into effect the 17th of August after they ratified. So it went into force for Angola 3 months, 9 days after ratification. Now, if you look at what happened in 2001, you say, well, what's there? Let's see. We have Brunei. Do we have anybody at the beginning? Oh, Afghanistan, Andorra, Brunei, okay, Iraq. It's all of our Somalia, all the real functional countries, right? U.S. ratified and signed initially, okay. And there are 186. I think now there are 190 because of the breakup of different Yugoslavia, whatever, split up countries. So I think there are about 190 or so ratifications of this. So everybody, almost everybody's on this one. It's not a disputed convention. Hence the principles of, most of the things that say greenhouse gases are a worry. The governments are not worried. They know it's a worry. This is not, if they fight the case, they fight it because they don't want to be billed too much for it. There's a negotiating stance, not an issue of science. Okay. So that's been in effect since '94. Basically, it's on the road, yeah.
Do all of the countries who are paying, do they all pay an even amount?
I have no idea. I certainly doubt it. This is done by the group that pays, gets together and fights over who's paying what. First of all, they fight over what they're going to pay for, what's worth paying for, in terms of the meetings, and then they argue over, I don't know how they partition the balance of payments.
Do you have any idea how much the total is that they have to pay?
I don't know. It's got to be big. My guess is to run the IPCC to do an assessment, which is 4 years running, it's probably $50 million minimum. I'm just sort of doing a quick estimate of travel expenses, budgets for everyone. It's a lot of money just to do one assessment. So that's why the governments don't like the IPCC starting off, we're going to do this assessment, we're going to do that assessment, because they say, we're going to pay for this, we want to make sure we do the ones we want, and not. So they don't like people starting off randomly. They don't like the scientists telling them when they want to do assessments. Partly because they just look at the budget and go, we can barely afford this. Because it comes out of some State Department budget somewhere, USAID, to do this, so it's not exactly free money. But the exact partitioning, I don't know. You can probably find it out. If you go in the Framework Convention, there ought to be a way to find out what the bills are, but I've not looked it up. As I said, part of it will be paying for the conventions, part of it's paying for developing countries to come at all, things like that, so it's a mix of things. Protocol, okay, 1997, in glory, Al Gore and company went to Kyoto and got this great protocol signed. Didn't get ratified, they got signed, okay. So what is a protocol? By analogy, the Vienna Convention to protect the ozone layer, around, I think, 77, was a convention recognizing ozone depletion was an issue due to chlorofluorocarbons way in the future. It was something important. The Montreal Protocol, under the Vienna Convention, was a separate protocol that had to be ratified by the Senate in our country, and it was to take place. It was a treaty. Okay, it had to be ratified, and it was basically saying, here's what we're going to do. Montreal Protocol said we're going to cut CFC emissions to half, production to half current production. And then they later amended it to say, no, we're going to get rid of all CFC production. Okay, so there were amendments to the protocol. The protocol then had requirements. The protocol had teeth for, this one's a little different, but Montreal Protocol, if you continue to produce chlorofluorocarbons, and even the developing countries had cutout dates, they were 10 years later. So all countries had requirements under the Montreal Protocol, but the developing countries were shifted 10 years, or 15 years, depending on what it was. So it's like shift down the line when they had to give it up. If you actually did not sign on, and continue to do it, everybody was required not to do any trade with you on any product that could possibly have used those things in their manufacturing, which would be pretty large, foam, refrigeration, everything else. Okay, so it had some teeth. Okay, Kyoto Protocol likewise has some teeth, but I'm not sure what the penalties are. I couldn't find them in here. So there's some level, there's a requirement, but I'm not sure quite what happens if somebody doesn't meet it's not clear what the requirements in Kyoto are if you actually fail to meet your things, which a lot of countries are not going to meet who signed on. So, Kyoto Protocol, nice blue, very pretty cover. Okay, being parties to the Framework Convention. You've got to be a part of the Framework Convention, number one. So it's underneath the Framework Convention. Then we're going to do this protocol. Defines the conference of the parties to the convention, which is basically the Framework Convention. It actually defines IPCC because it's going to use it. These IPCC results here. Defines Montreal Protocol because it's going to make sure that this protocol does not interfere with the other existing international treaties on pollution issues like CFCs. So there'll be other things where another treaty takes place, they will not touch it, they will do other things. So separation so you don't cause trouble. Anything we launch it on, okay. Okay. We get into Article 2, what are the goals? Each party achieves elaborate measures in accordance with national, such as enhancement of energy efficiency, protection of this. Okay, this is to promote sustainable development. It's all the good things. Okay, nothing obvious measured. That's sort of feel good. Now here we go. Is a minor one. I circled this one because this is one of the issues that was left unsolved. It's still unresolved. Is what do you do with international bunker fuels? So parties in Annex 1 shall pursue limitation or reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases not controlled by the protocol from aviation and bunker fuel. So Montreal Protocol is doing all our chlorinated gases and brominated gases. Then we have airplane fuel, which is not taxed as international, so it's not under a given country. So there's bunker fueled LAX, meant for international flights, that sits there and basically goes for the international flights, and keeping track of it is a little difficult, and also who gets credit for it, who's responsible for it, it's not a national emission. So international shipping, international air travel are bunker fuels, and that's the thing that the question is how to do it. There's still no resolution. You're looking at 2% of the fossil fuel, 2.3 I think for aircraft, and maybe about, I think it might be 5.5 to 6 for shipping. A lot more. So that's just one of the issues that you'll see come up again. Bunker fuels, IMO, and ICAO, Civil Aviation Organization, International Maritime Organization. We're still trying to figure out how to get those organizations to be in compliance for all of shipping or for all of aviation. Although not everybody's waiting, Europe's doing their own thing on aviation. Article 3, individually, jointly, reduction commitments in Annex B. So look at Annex B, okay. Parties in Annex 1, that's the Annex 1 you've seen, okay. Shall individually, jointly ensure they have reduction commitments in Annex B. The time frame is 2808 to 2012. We're already halfway through. That seemed like forever in those days. It's a 5-year period, and it's fairly vague. You know, if you're reducing 5% below 1990 for the period, so it's like when did it occur? Sometime that 5-year period is the average of the 5-year period. It doesn't really say, but that's okay because that's the least of the problems on this. Okay. So the goal is to reduce it. One of the things is it's 1990 levels. So 1990 levels, Russia was high, was burning all sorts of fossil fuel. It collapsed. The economy collapsed and all the bad industry shut down, so Russian emissions went way down for a while. They're going back up again. So they had a lot of credits to sell, for example. The other one basically was that, again, 1990 levels were agreed upon because everybody made a reporting of it, but nobody knows how good those numbers are. They're all reported, they're agreed upon, they're codified, but we can't go back and measure them. We don't have enough measurements to go back. The new techniques won't work. How do we go back in time and find out what really the 1990 levels were? It's actually it's an ongoing problem now as to what the baseline numbers are. When people are proposing something relative to baseline, they go, yeah, but how well the governments know that there's a problem with baselines. Okay, greenhouse gas emissions by sources and removals by sinks associated with those activities. So this is, they're counting both emissions as well as changing sinks uptake, which is fine. So if you have something like forests, which suck up CO2, you have some way to pull methane out, okay. It doesn't necessarily include NOx emissions, which enhance OH, which take up methane. They haven't gotten that far yet because that doesn't quite count here, but it does effectively, could be counted as including if you can get methane out of the atmosphere by some source in your country, you might get credit for it. It's a little vague, but I think they don't want to count it. Modalities, rules, guidelines, okay, conference to parties, da-da-da. This is agricultural land. This is a difficult one. Okay, change greenhouse gas by removals in agricultural land, land use change, forestry categories, added to, subtracted from. This is still always a thorny issue. The big issue now is red, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from destruction and something of forests, REDD. There's REDD plus, you can see it all over the web, UN. This is the whole forestry thing. This came out of Bali in 2007. It's sort of the hot topic of how to manage the forest to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Mainly because it affects mostly developing countries, and developing countries can then get credit, money, and support and technology to try to do this. So it's a tech transfer the saving forests will save greenhouse gases. Okay, the first period for quantified emission limitations and reduction commitment period. Quantified emission limitations and reductions, and they're called CELROs, Q-E-L-R-O, I forget what the O is, and you'll see it later used a lot. It's been picked up more recently, so there's an issue of CELROs for Copenhagen or whatever. That's the Annex 1 commitment. It's quantified emission limitation reduction. So you're actually going to say exactly how much you're going to reduce or limit your emissions. That you'll see. Any emission reduction assigned amount party acquires some other party accord with Article 6 shall have added to the assigned amount for the acquiring party. It's sort of like you can trade the stuff. Okay, and so there's things where the Annex 1 countries could trade. Okay, and then there's the thing where the Annex 1 countries can actually trade with the developing countries who don't have any commitments. That's called clean development mechanism, whereby you put in place a clean development mechanism in a developing country like Central America, Brazil, whatever, it's sold these very well, in return for which they say that will reduce the emissions from that country. The developed country gets credit for it. And so one of the problems is how much credit you can get on that. The Europeans and the US fight over if you did it. can you get 20% of your emissions reduced this way, or 5, or 100, you know. So how much credit can you get by off-selling, you know, by moving off the site, so to speak. But this has set up a whole series of things here on how you could trade or not trade, okay, and the rules. That starts the process of sort of allowing a flexible trading mechanism for greenhouse gas emissions, which is reasonable. Without it, it'd be much tougher in some sense, and also sort of the economists love it. Each party shall have no later than 1 year prior to the start of the first commitment a national system for estimating greenhouse gas emissions removal. So, like the reporting, you have to have a fairly stable system, same as national reporting. Methodologies, will be agreed upon by the IPCC for non-Montreal Protocol gases, okay. Global warming potential. There we go on the bottom, our GWPs in Working Group 1. This whole table of GWPs they put out that nobody scientists wonder why. Well, because they're going to be used. They're requested specifically by the Framework Convention. They're the way to exchange gases. So when you see CO2 equivalent, remember you multiply the gas emission by the GWP, and that becomes the CO2 equivalent emission. So a lot of the units will be things like 1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. That's what the EPA does in national reporting. And they actually use CO2, not carbon. So it's molecular weight 44. So if you see MMTOEs, TCOEs, you end up seeing, instead of like 8,000 to 9,000 emissions of carbon, you'll see something more like 35 or something because it includes the 2 oxygens, so it's way heavier. So be careful on units. So GWPs to whatever, and methods and sinks are done by IPCC. May transfer or acquire from any other party such emission reduction units resulting from projects aimed at by sources enhancing and removing sources sinks in any sector of the economy, provided that. Okay. So again, they said before there are trades allowed under Article 6 something and 17. So Article 6 has one way of doing trading. Okay. There's another way of trading under Article 17. Again, it has to do with whether it's between parties to the protocol and Annex 1 or non-Annex 1.
Are countries actually trading this
Yeah.
now?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So CDMs are being sold and bought in a lot of Central America, South American countries are very good. Eastern Europe didn't get SWIFT on it. But Central America, South America got very SWIFT. They were finally approved about 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They had to go through a laborious process of documenting what the project would be, did it save, and whatever, and then somebody in the UN, there'd be an organization that would certify it, and therefore it had a certain so many million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and it could then, and how much the country got paid or given for it was up to them to negotiate, but it was a certified savings. It was not quite an open carbon market, but the country said, I'll offer you this, and we want $1 million if you want to put this down in our place, or we get free technology or whatever. I mean, that was up to the countries to negotiate. There's not an open market on the CDMs. The countries offer them.
And so like the, U.S. could offer it and say, I want X amount of dollars, and you have to reduce your emissions by X in order to get
No,
this? Or
what they'd say is Costa Rica or Ecuador would say, we will do the following in forested areas. We'll basically clean out the underbrush, allow new stuff to grow cleanly. We will recycle this or compact it into paper that's used for something else, and basically effectively will manage this area so as to save CO2 and basically suck stuff up at a given rate we think is reasonable. Somebody will certify if you did that, we think we'd be removing so much CO2 from the atmosphere. Then the US can effectively go in and buy it and pay for it at whatever cost. But then the agreed amount of CO2 they save has already been certified by somebody else.
got it.
So there are people who then certify the CO2 by the mechanism. So this is clean development mechanism. Article 6 was the joint implementation. That's between the Annex 1s can trade. This is clean development mechanism, okay? Parties not included in Annex 1. Parties not included in Annex 1 will benefit from project activities. So this is not Annex 1. These are project activities, okay? Whereas the other one was trading between those people who have commitments. This is trading outside of the Annex 1 commitment zone. This was barely squeaked in, and I know the person, Dan Riedschneider, was doing the negotiating on this, and he and Jovan Marafilo from Brazil actually got this in at the very end. This was one of the interesting ones. They were really pushing hard to get in because they thought it was very important. And it turned out to be fairly important to get in there. It was sort of a marginal call. So this is important. You'll see that often. I forget the other one. Okay, United Nations specialized any body raising any intergovernmental, non-governmental qualified matters protocol. Counts to the parties, and again, usual who could attend. Articles, a bunch of things, odds and ends. I didn't find, so it's pretty boring. 2. Here we go. Here's the key one. When does it go into force? 90th day after the date on which no less than 55 parties to the Framework Convention sign, including parties in Annex 1, which account for 55% of the total carbon dioxide emissions for 1990. It's not carbon dioxide equivalent, it's actually CO2. Okay. So number one is everybody said what they emitted in 1990, and then it became hardened. Nobody knows whether it's true or not, but those numbers are out there. They're official numbers. Okay. So you had to have 55 governments out of 180 something, and of those 55, you had to have 55% of the Annex 1 1990 emissions. Annex 1 was probably about 60% of the total, 70% of the total in 1990. Now I think it's less than 50%. But, okay. And so that's the amount communicated on before the date of adoption. Okay. Okay. Notice it defines, for the purposes of this article, the total carbon dioxide for 1990 means the amount communicated on or before the date of adoption of this protocol by the parties in the Annex 1. So they even haven't agreed upon what the numbers are, necessarily, before they adopt. They have to put that in first, okay? In accordance with Article 12, which then says how they do it and what the rules are. Okay. And then done at Kyoto and witness thereof. So, again, generally signed by the governments of Kyoto because the executive branches were there. They wanted to do this. They wrote this treaty literally. Okay, and then they had to bring it back to their countries and sell it. And so what do we have in Kyoto? We have Annex A. Annex A says what species are in there, not what countries. They're using Annex 1 and Annex 2 for the countries. Annex A says what are the greenhouse gases? It defines them, okay? So we have our big three, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then we have all the fluorinated ones. All the fluorinated ones have no known source except for one obscure one, which we're not going into. But all the fluorinated gases are synthetic. All but one of them has zeros, you go back in time, okay? And so, but they are probably less than 1% of the total greenhouse gas emissions by any way you look at it. They're really small. Maybe 1% at most, maybe 2 now, but no, really small. The other thing it tells you is what sectors and categories. So it says don't say you can't count this. We've given you a list of everything. And in case we forgot everything, I love it. It says other. So it reminds you, energy is a sector, industrial processes, agriculture. These are the big sectors, okay? Or after, okay? They remind you, waste handling, okay, it's another big problem, especially for things like methane and nitrous oxide. And so then we get Annex B. Annex B lists countries, and it has your quantified emission limitation reduction. And so you notice that these are in percents of 1990, and these are set for the period 2008 to 2012. This is what the goal was, okay? Australia and Iceland negotiated an increase. New Zealand negotiated a decrease and got really screwed by it. They thought they were going to get credit for all their forestry stuff, and it turns out they're not. So New Zealand accepted 100%, but they're in trouble because they really need fossil fuels in an island state. They don't have much renewables, okay? And what they used for fossil fuel they were using, they thought they were going to get credit for their forestry. Instead, they got dinged for their sheep harder, I think. So they really got, nobody knows how they got swindled on this one. Australia got 108%, Iceland got 110. Arguing as island nations, they effectively had a very different problem. Iceland already has a lot of renewable, but all their fossil fuel was in the fishing fleet and shipping, and there's just no way to get around that one. They can't become more limited to what they can do. So they argued they had to have a small increase over 30 years, 20 years. Everybody else had about 5 to 8% reductions, you can see. So NXP was that, okay. US, and we don't have the EU yet. There's no EU one, as you can see. It's not listed. The European Community is listed as 92, but it's not quite the same. Okay, ratification. This was as of 2002. Some of the signatories are missing, but this was sort of the ratification. It wasn't that much. You can see a lot of gaps as you go down that second column. Okay, Romania. 47 countries have ratified as of 2001. It didn't hit the 55 countries. Okay, and so what they did, but the ratifications were cute. I love this one. These are all the little declarations when countries ratify. So European Union says they're going to fulfill. All the little islands had this famous quote in them. Government of Niue says the ratification shall in no way constitute renunciation of rights. We can sue. We still reserve the right to sue even though we signed on to this treaty. It does not relieve any other government from being sued by us for sea level rise. Okay, it's very funny. They always want to put that little thing in signing on the treaty. Now, signing on the treaty then means nothing. The only thing they can do is they get benefits out of clean development mechanism. So it's harmless. Any government who's not in Annex 1 to sign on this treaty is a freebie. Okay, but it's pretty funny that thing. So Issue the text, okay. This, again, is the line. 55 days, whatever. So what you saw was, oops. That's better, okay. What you saw was this Kyoto thermometer for a long time, and this was as of 2003. Okay, and so then more countries had signed on. You actually then had 104 governments. And so the numbers were well above that 55 level. The blue were Annex 1, and then the green were not Annex 1. So there were 100-some parties signing on. This was not a problem. We had the 55 parties, but of course the green parties didn't count for the greenhouse gas emissions. So you had to have the red thermometer, which reached 55% of emissions. And this was on, for a long time, was the famous Kyoto thermometer. It was way down for a while. And so if you look at it, because this was right after the European Union signed on, you got all the countries signed on, they were at 40-some%, I think 44, whatever. And what I've listed is the remaining countries on the right. So we have Liechtenstein and Monaco, which I didn't bother finding the percentages because they didn't mean much. Switzerland, 1/3%. Australia is 2%, still nothing. It's the US and Russia, okay. Russia was categorized in 1990 emissions at 17.4 and the US at 36.1 on Annex 1. So if the US signed, it automatically goes into effect, but after the European Union signed, they get Russia to sign, it goes into effect. So they had to persuade the Russians it's worth it. So the Russians have been going hot and cold on this for years. There's a period around 2001, 2003, they were going bouncing up and down. Yes, they were going to accept, and then the government said, no, no, no. And they're all judging it basically as to how much money they can make by selling their credits. This is not, I mean, this is strictly an issue of money involved here. And so finally, the Europeans convinced the Soviets, I think they never got it paid off, that they would get a lot of money by selling all their credits. So the Soviets finally agreed to ratify, despite the US thing. So here's the ratification being handed. This is the one that counted. So this basically is 2004, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, November 2004, so it goes into effect in February 2005, 90 days later. And so this one, everybody was cheering. Yeah, okay, at least the European Union was. They won. Of course, the Russians. I don't think the Russians ever saw that much out of it. I think they got a little bit of hornswoggle, but maybe they got a pipeline they wanted. I don't know. I mean, this was all political dealing, because then the US was trying to pull them back the other way. Okay. So Kyoto is now in effect. Australia's government has changed dramatically. Okay, about what, same with Obama, about the time Obama was elected, the Australian government reversed from their being extreme friends of Bush to being the opposite. So Australia immediately ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So I think the US is the only country left that's not really part of the protocol, except for Somalia and other places that are dysfunctional, but in general. Okay, so those are the documents. And they sort of, you can see from the paragraphs and the lines, they start up some of the fights, you know, common but differentiated responsibilities, you know, who's to be held accountable for this? Most of the emissions are all due to developed countries, okay. So that's sort of the basis of all the squabbles, or even the design of what the negotiation should look like. Okay, any thoughts or questions on that one? This one I want to go through quickly. This is the non-science side. This is what's happening, news and whatever. So this is just to get a flavor for it. Reflects the documents. So you're going to see news and squabbles about what happened, what didn't happen. Okay. So, you know, what's happening with the Framework Convention now? Let's look at COP15, what happened before and after that in Copenhagen, which was 2009. COP16 is in Cancun. The COPs are always the end of November, beginning of December, 2 weeks long. We'll look at those, okay? And so this is beginning the update, okay? But first, I have my favorite, okay? This is a perspective from your Defense Department. Well, at least U.S. Defense Department. This is the front page of the New York Times in April. How many of you saw this? You did see it originally, okay. I opened up my morning paper and went, whoa, this is great. I had a talk that day, so I managed to trace it, feel it, and use it, okay. This is front page above the fold. This is big time. Okay, below the fold doesn't count, above the fold counts for newspapers. And we have this PowerPoint diagram. I don't know what ANSF is, population conditions belief. This is a PowerPoint diagram to explain how they were doing the war in Afghanistan, okay? And so, this is the article title, We Have Met the Enemy, and here's PowerPoint. I loved it. This is, some of the quotes in here are the best I've ever seen because they really are wonderful. So when I do my PowerPoint talk for the second part of the section, you can comment on this. I like it, it makes us stupid, okay. The illusion of understanding, I think. Some problems in the world are not bulletizable. My favorite is they use it for what, feeding the chickens, what they describe as hypnotizing the chickens. Hypnotizing the chickens is they use this to brief the press. So the press gets so mesmerized that they cannot bother asking intelligent questions when they're out in the field, and they mesmerize the press, hypnotize the chickens, and then go off and do their work. So I love it that they use it to hypnotize the chickens. It's pretty funny. How they got these people to say this stuff, I don't know, it's pretty good. Copenhagen, okay. This was about a year ago. So the news coming out about a year ago. Copenhagen was the big event because it was 2 years after Bali, and Bali was COP13. I went to Bali, actually, to a science presentation in Bali, okay? It was interesting. It got very far along. Bali came along with a whole bunch of things. They had the Bali roadmap, is what they called it. They were famous for both. Copenhagen's famous for its accord. Bali's famous for its roadmap. The roads needed some help out there, but it was pretty fun. The Bali one then had to deal with measurable, reportable, and verifying greenhouse gases. It had to do with the forestry issues, which were very big in Bali. I couldn't get into sessions that they were discussing anything on forestry. All the NGOs and everybody was there. When the forestry thing stopped, they went something else, everybody cleared out. So forestry was a really big issue at the Bali meeting, COP13. And they came up with the concept of RED, R-E-D-D, which is reduction of emissions from foresting, destruction of forest. And then they also had this roadmap. The roadmap pointed 2 years ahead. The conflicts of parties are usually every other year that are big. Every non-year is like develop things, work on issues, and think about it. This time Cancun's in trouble because Copenhagen failed. Okay, normally Cancun would be an off year. So this was coming online already in October. There are, I think I have some September ones. Little chance already have time running short. People already think ahead of time in October it's going to be a mess. This is well a month before it begins. Okay, there have been plans, people are planning what's on the agenda ahead of time, but there's already things that, there's depressing articles that, things are going to happen. Gulf between emissions core is too wide. Okay, this is continuation. Again, Todd Stern is the U.S. negotiator going to Copenhagen. It's the new Obama climate team, okay. Promise to create international systems. So everybody's hope is really high because you have Todd Stern, you have Obama, but maybe not. No formal deal in Copenhagen, so Andy Revkin's getting depressed. This is November, we're approaching 2 weeks ahead of time, okay. I forget. Leaders degree delay, again, November 15th, clock running out. They still haven't resolved their differences. In general, you go into these meetings with an agreement that the major people saying we're going to push the follow. Have everybody involved, at least the major power brokers will come in saying what they hope to get out of the meeting, and it's clear it wasn't going to happen. There were some problems, okay. This is November 16th coming in, again, huddle and fight against global warming, all these depressing things. Not everyone blames the U.S. for the deadlock. Not everyone. The European Union official says, but he sure did, it's very funny. Okay. And then we have the IPCC government said compromise, whether this was an honest admission of I know what Pachari's talking about, but it's not right. Okay, U.S. set emissions. The U.S. said they're going to actually put emissions targets ahead of time, so they're going to come in with their own emission targets, so they can bring something to the table. Okay, China deliver more specific pledge on carbon intensity issues, so China will bring something, so the governments are bringing forward what their pledges would be. Okay, finally, we get Obama agreed to go to the convention, go to Copenhagen. Announced Wednesday. The problem is the first time he's going to go in the first week. First week in the meeting is nothing. He actually had the timing wrong because he had something the second week, so he wasn't even going to attend. It's the second week that matters usually. You don't get any high-level delegations until the second week. The first week is basically all State Department people and whatever. You don't get assistant secretaries and everything going until the second part. So Obama had the wrong timing, but he later changed it. Okay, and then finally, he said he hoped Obama would attend the final days because he wasn't going to attend the final days. And he actually did change his mind and show up at the end. Okay. China joins U.S. in hard targets. Announced Thursday set targets to slow growth. This is all leading right up to the opening. Okay, everybody's starting to push this sort of stuff. Cancun, China, India, and U.S. expected crucial players. Okay. Then we have something on forest that came out again at the same time. What trees might look like. So it's a big issue from our friends up north in forest. Okay. And then you basically finally get into COP after all that. So it starts December 7th. So this whole 2-3 weeks ahead of time, governments are planning what they're going to bring. They're also leaking and pronouncing, we're bringing this, we're going to promise this. So, sort of pushing, shoving, and angling. This is basically the 2-week setup, okay? What occurs is 6 meetings. Conference of the Parties, 15. 5th Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol, CMP5. It's the 5th year that the protocol has been in effect. So the Kyoto Protocol parties, not mine. Substance, SBI, those are the subsidiary bodies that deal with all the junk and passing it forward and saying, yes, we accept the IPCC assessment, here are the new numbers, and here's the science, so they have their names. Then we have two groups that were new, and they were added in the last, since around Bali and the time before, which are odd groups, AWGs, ad hoc working groups, KP, and LCA. Okay, why are they set up? They don't really belong, this adds to the confusion. The US is not a member of CMP5, because we are not part of Kyoto. Therefore, any discussion would have to take place in the COP15, but not the Kyoto one. So that would mean that in COP15, you don't want to start negotiating necessarily what your future is. Kyoto was supposed to negotiate, the CMP would be talking about what the commitment period after Kyoto would be. So everybody's worried about the post-Kyoto commitment period, 2008 to 2012 was disappearing soon, okay? Now the question is what's next? So the ad hoc working groups were a kludge. They were put together specifically to allow the US and all the other countries to sit in the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action. That's where discussion of what post-Kyoto looks like is going to happen. This is just the European Union and a few others trying to figure out what are we going to do. Do we have any options for Kyoto or whatever? This is a separate group. These people also sit in this group. Okay. They couldn't agree on a process, so they declared two ad hoc working groups at one of the meetings, and that has been going on for a long time. You'll see this. What happens in the LCA is actually probably fairly important. That's where a lot of the action will be, because it's the US and all the other governments saying, what are we going to do post-Kyoto? Okay. This is a calendar, it looks like. You start on December 7th. You have opening sessions of the COP and the CMIP and the Kyoto group. Then you have the ad hoc working groups meeting, splitting in the afternoon, and then you begin the subsidiary bodies groups, okay? The plenary sessions look something like the right. I love the sea of faces. It's hard to imagine how far, what a wide angle lens they took this at. I mean, this is just a huge room. The Bali one was the largest one I've been in. It was immense. All the governments sit in front. You can see Afghanistan on the lower right on the flag. It's alphabetical, off the right, government start. And then you end at the back end, Zimbabwe and others, okay? And then after that, the way in the tailback, it's always alphabetical, so you always get stuck in the back. The way in the tailback are things like NGOs. So the Climate Coalition, which is a bunch of coal manufacturers, the Friends of the Earth, other people sit back there, basically. And they have their own flags, they sit way in the back. They get recognized if the chair wishes to recognize non-governmentals. They don't have to be recognized if they want to speak. If there's too much business going on, it'll be ignored. Okay. Second week starts moving on like this. We have informal groups. We close already by Tuesday, things close. The ad hoc working groups close up, okay? And then you start Thursday, 17th of December, the end of the last end of the week is high-level COP, CMIP, foreign ministers, heads of delegations, and so on, okay? This is the big time, okay? This is usually when it gets shut off, except for non-governmental people. I think they had to close it down because it was too busy. People got thrown out, or people snuck in and tried to sleep overnight to get in, whatever, problem. This is sort of when all the heads of state appear. And then Copenhagen fails, okay. All the wringing of hands, why did it fail, okay. There are various things. What came out was the Copenhagen Accord. And everybody regards it as a failure. Again, on the lower right, you can see the huge venue with big screens on the left and thousands of people on the right. Okay, the big fight was that the Copenhagen Accord was stuck between the basic nations and the US and the European Union. Basic is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. Okay, it did not include the G77, the group of 77, which is everybody in all the developing countries, did not include Africa. Everybody's upset that basically the power brokers made the decision instead of doing it all in plenary, which is probably the only way it could have been done because the plenary would take forever and somebody would always object. Small island states would get up and say, no, we don't want you. So this is the problem. Plenary is not very effective at getting things done. And the US people I know said they would never negotiate a climate convention in the UN framework again, ever, because it's basically totally ineffective. Because anytime you come up with something, any country can basically hold up the whole process. Okay? And so, from the point of view when you have 190 governments, somebody always wants to speak. One of the problems is somebody always wants to speak. If they don't want to hold up the process, they like to hear themselves. And so it's really difficult to get things done when you have 190 different entities. Well, just with the hold the flag that stops it. So there was this problem, okay, it was viewed as a mess. Why? Because nothing happened within the framework convention, it happened in a small group. Okay, so the basic countries, the US or whatever, came up with this this new Copenhagen Accord, And everybody complained because the Bali Action Plan was a great action plan. All the governments agreed to that in a big convention, in the sort of plenary, and they were upset that nothing happened with the Bali Action Plan. This one is why Climate Boss admits Copenhagen failed. Climate Boss would be their chief negotiator, Ivo de Boer, sort of head of the secretary. Yeah.
You may have touched on this previously, but what are the repercussions if the countries don't meet the Kyoto Protocol targets, or?
It's not really clear what the penalties are. There's supposed to be penalties for not meeting Kyoto targets, but already half the European countries can't meet them. I don't know what the consequences are. I never looked at it. There's supposed to be penalties, but it's not obvious in the protocol what the penalties are. The current version, okay? I'm not sure what actually happens to you.
And so do you think
other than,
Oh.
I feel him, other than finger pointing, but I'm not sure what the responsibilities are if you fail to meet it. I mean, clearly you've lost some face, but I'm not sure what the practical implications are. I didn't find anything in there about trade sanctions and other issues when I was skimming a long time ago, but I haven't looked recently.
I mean,
so that's a good question.
Do you know, is that one of the reasons the U.S. has decided not to sign it? Or could you summarize quickly?
Okay, why the U.S. signed it but didn't ratify? Okay, executive branch signed it. The Senate refused to bring it up for ratification. Why did the Senate refuse to bring it up for ratification? Because, very simply, it didn't have any public support in the country, and everybody thought we were selling ourselves down the road for no advantage, and everybody wanted China and India to have commitments, and our government didn't want to do it without that, and so on. This was a political decision within the Senate. Okay? And so the question is, what would it take the Senate to do it? I don't know. I think our Senate has become totally dysfunctional, very sadly. We have a law of the sea treaty that we must ratify soon. We're one of the few people who are not part of the law of the sea treaty because we have refused to ratify. Even everybody from Bush 1, Bush 2, Clinton, and Obama wants the law of the sea treaty ratified. It gives us power in the north when the ice melts. Without it, we cannot claim any land up there. There's an extension of Alaska's continental crust issue. The Russians are claiming to the pole, so is Norwegian, everybody else, because the continent. So without being part of the law of the sea treaty, we are really messed up and we're in trouble. Everybody wants that done. Why the Senate won't do it? And I was in the State Department during a heavy Republican administration, which was somewhat repressive. I've seen it since. Everybody wanted that sign, even the political appointees. The State Department wanted that LOS sign because the law of the sea treaty was critical for the U.S. to play an active role internationally in the law of the sea. Because we won't ratify it, we're not part of it. So why the Senate won't do these things, I don't know. Maybe it sounds bad, but there's a big, there are big issues where the Senate has somehow been dysfunctional. It's not an even debate. What are the pluses and minuses? They just won't even bring it up. So it's the same thing with Kyoto. It would have gone down 99-0. That wasn't a rational debate. It was a political choice. Nobody wanted to be tagged as being responsible for committing the U.S. to reductions when not all the other countries were.
And does that have to deal with the cost of it primarily?
The cost of it is this is politics. I can just the cost of it.
Sorry,
is a big.
wanna...
The cost is a big Republican issue. Okay, when Bush was in, it was always the cost of it. Now it's not the cost; it's the fairness. Why are we committing to it? So the Democrats may have been hit by the cost thing on the re-election issue. I don't know, but the economical cost has always been a Republican issue. Democrats have never really, partly because the economic cost of it really is very uncertain. Some people say it's minimal, some people say it's huge. The science, the economics is generally not there that well to say what the real cost is, and so Republicans pick one side, Democrats another. But that's why I don't think it's the cost alone. I mean, that motivates some parts as to why we don't do it. But I think why the Senate doesn't do it is there's something that makes it look like something really bad. No senator wants to have that on their name for some reason. I don't know what it is. Okay? That's probably because the public is not screaming at them to do it. Okay? If the public were screaming at them to do it, they do it. But all they get is people telling them how terrible it is. For whatever reason, cost, unfairness, whatever. So it's not, the ability, it's not even, as I said, it's not brought up for debate and vote. They just say, no, it's not going to happen. Second law thing. So this one I love because this is why Copenhagen failed. Everybody fell asleep. I love the pictures they get. Don't forget to look up the Earth Negotiation Bulletin, the ENB people out of Canada. They'll be doing daily reporting basically on COP15. They're doing it now for a meeting in Tianjin, which is the Chinese hosted an early preliminary meeting. Usually they're in Bonn. This is a preliminary sort of week-long or so meeting to start getting documents in place to bring up in Cancun. But this one has failed. Again, the big fight was that nothing was happening. It was going downhill to be even worse. The US and the basic governments in Europe got together and basically came up with their own accord, which then everybody else condemned, but at least it did something. Without it, it would have been nothing out of Copenhagen. It would have been even worse. So it's still a funny battle as to what's a success or not. This is the Copenhagen Accord. It's fairly simple. It involves these two groups, our LCA and KP groups, Kyoto Protocol and long-term operation. Okay. The agreement is fairly short, just says we're going to be good. That's it. And then it has 2 pages to fill out. The 2 pages are the Kelro type things for the work for the Annex 1 and the NAMAs for the developing countries. Okay, Kelros are quantified emission limitation and reduction objectives. Okay, that came out of Kyoto. Saw that in Kyoto. NAMAs are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. That came out of Bali in 2007. So every COP or something develops its own acronyms and favorite expressions. Nationally appropriate mitigation actions are not a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases. They are a commitment to take activities that would reduce greenhouse gases, in theory. Okay? It's not a commitment. It's a commitment to appropriate mitigation activities. And so if we look at China, these are the letters that came in. So if you're at NAMAs, for example, Appendix 1 will be the Annex 1. Appendix 2 to the Copenhagen lists various people who have submitted their things to Copenhagen, which had to be done by January this year. Okay, and this is the Chinese one. This is the entire Chinese submission to their NAMAs. Okay, and if you look at it, what does it say? It will reduce carbon by per GDP. That will increase its efficiency. Okay, increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy to 15%, and increase forest coverage by 40 million hectares. And forest stock by 1.3 billion cubic meters. That's going to be really hard to tell. The 40 million hectares you could probably measure, but I'm not sure they can measure with the carbon stock, but the forest stock is going to increase by so many cubic meters. Okay. So that's their short list of NAMAs. Okay. So improved efficiency per GDP, shift to non-fossil fuels in the energy sector, okay, which is solar and wind, they're already doing that, and then basically reforestation, because they have a lot of deforested areas that got wiped out earlier. So that's an example of, they're not committing to reduce CO2 by so much, but they're committing certain actions. Okay, then we have the UNSC Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. That was the Copenhagen Accord. We had Bonn talks in June. We have Cancun coming up in December. There's an intermediate meeting now going on in Tianjin. Okay, so that's it. And now even after this, we already have things. This is recent. Yeah, this is May this year. Climate negotiation. Everybody's in a depressive mode. Everybody likes to write depressive articles. So these are again 2 articles came out in May, which is relative to the basically the June meeting. So this is preparatory to the Bonn meeting, which was the half-year meeting. Okay, we already have squabbling in Germany. Negotiation totally stalled. Okay, and Bonn really didn't get very far either. Again, the fights were over between this little accord document, which a small group of countries got in, and the rest saying, no, you have to do it in plenary. And that's one of the big fights you'll see in Copenhagen coming up. So this is Cancun. No idea what we can expect from Cancun, but that's it looks nice. I wish I got invited. It'd be fun. I'd love to go there for a week, but hey, it's during classes, so can't do it. Good. So let's do a 5-minute break, and then we'll hit working group 2. Oh, climate gate. We don't know about climate gate. Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm not going to do. I may do working group 3 later. I was supposed to put it way off, but unfortunately, Donald Dabba went out, and I may see you in 2 or 3 weeks, which I was going to put off till later. But working group 2 is the impacts one, so we'll look at that. Working group 3 is the economy, cost of carbon markets, how much you can save in buildings, and so on. So it's a view of the economy and the technology of how much you could actually mitigate. So we're going to primarily work on 2. This is 2. Look at the number of chapters. My God, big number of authors. It must be painful to go through that one. Okay. We're going to look at the summary for policymakers. There's also a technical summary I posted. The chapters you can find online if you get interested, but I would not start with those. We're going to start with just the summary Policymakers. The technical one has another like 50 pages more details. We'll take a brief look at it if we get to it, but I don't think we'll get too far on that one. So the goal is to sort of say what's really covered on this. And so we see basically, chapters from chapter 1 again being assessment of observed changes, and actually a useful chapter, new methodologies, okay? We get down through the countries and the regions. So this starts the summary. They warn you, they actually tell you what's in it. It's very useful in the SPM. They want to remind you because it's a complicated working group. We have sort of assessments of future impact by sectors and whatever, coastal systems, human health and issues. Then we have by regions, okay? And then you have section D on responses. And so it's a fairly complicated section that has to deal with a lot of different problems on how do you look at things. Unlike working group 1, just says what's happening out there, what's causing it. So they have a tougher assignment. It's also a lot what you call softer sciences, as you can see. This list, all the regions, just to make sure no countries were in there, if you can find your country in there, okay. The regions are given, they want to make sure every country in the Framework Convention knows where they sit. You're in this region, you're in that region, okay, everybody has to be listed. So remind you what's included. Which is not good. And then they actually give you an overview, which is pretty good. And so this is some hot topics. So they've done some, what are the hot topics? So the European heat wave in 2003, the impacts of climate change on coral reefs is another hot topic. So they pulled out several hot topics in their summary, which was a nice touch, I think, and said, okay, where are you going to find information on this? Because there isn't a chapter on coral reefs and what's happening to them. Likewise, the heat wave did various things, okay? And so the heat wave, you've got scene setting and overview, impact on sectors, impact of the heat wave on various sectors. So we have ecological, industry, health impacts, agriculture. So you see different chapters, they tell you what section it came in. It actually goes down into the report. So it's digging deeper into the report, but it says there are summary things going on. We'll pull them up here. You have to go down the chapters if you want to find them, but recognize if you want to look at the heat wave impacts, you're going to have to look at several different chapters. So actually, I think this is actually a very useful thing to have done. It's not really summarizing results, which they'll try to summarize the results in one paragraph, but it's really saying where the underlying material is. Again, coral reefs are spread out. What are the other big issues they have? And sort of remind you what are the hot topics that everybody blames. Megadeltas, vulnerability, climate change, sea level rise, other issues. Megadeltas are usually full of very many people who are very poor, who do not have much fresh water available, and have health problems. So sea level rises, they get washed away. If their fresh water disappears, they really are constantly living barely with fresh water supply. Health issues are always a problem in population, in a place like this also. And then you have indigenous knowledge for adaptation to climate change, which became a hot topic. Okay, which is what do indigenous peoples historically have done to adapt to climate change? What is their knowledge on how they have adapted? What have they done? Change crops, change whatever. So there's an argument that there's a huge amount. I think it's probably overstated a bit, but there's this huge amount of indigenous knowledge, which is worth billions and billions if only we could tap into it. And some of it is, there's some not, but the idea is we're going, the world is going to be so different, both for economy, climate, and whatever. I just wonder, but there's this view, it's important. It's a very hot topic, as you can imagine, among some of the countries, okay? So this gets at least pulled together, which is good. Okay. And now we hit the summary for policymakers, okay? So now we're up to pages 7 and 8 finally, after all the little lead-ins and hot topics, okay? And so this now begins the opening of summary, but the fact that you want to think about the other material was put in front of it, and it's useful, sort of frontispiece. If you look at working group 1, the frontispiece has nothing in it, a bunch of boilerplate, okay? This one they actually put something in front that was useful. Let's look quickly at the summary just for structure. We have our title page, our authors, we have our usual, it's formatted similarly. We have our big blue things with white in the front, and we have these funny little brick red fonts that are very narrow on yellow background that are really hard to read. That are supposed to be the most important points in the entire summary. Okay. So we have this page which goes into current knowledge, and we hit what's happening today. We have one big figure, we have one big figure, world figure, showing impacts and whatever, we'll look at that one. We then have, current knowledge about future impacts. So we have several pages, a lot of details, including sectors. We go through the sectors, okay. We have sort of an overall summary figure, which says what happens as the Earth gets warmer on the warmers to the right. We'll look at that. So one big figure. Table on impacts by sector and whatever. Okay, and then we have some common knowledge again. Current knowledge in responding to climate change, systematic observing and research, And then we end it with a bunch of boxes on reminding you about the scenarios on the right, reminding you about definition of terms, and reminding you about what uncertainty is used in this report. So those three little blue boxes are sort of meaningless things. They're just reminding you, it's like footnotes, extended footnotes. So first thing you know is, what does Working Group 2 really have? They've got a lot of words. They have one picture there, which we'll look at, which has some funny colors and a few numbers on it. They've got a qualitative thing with arrows and colors getting right on one side, okay? Very little numbers on that. If you look at the right, the numbers are to the chapter sections. And then we have this one table, okay? Working Group 2 has problems coming up with hard numbers, facts, and whatever, okay? It's a tough one to deal with, okay? You know, what are the impacts on people? What's the cost been on agriculture? Those things are hard to get out. The chapters don't have them. There's nothing they can do at this level, okay? So this is one of the tougher chapters. Unlike Working Group 3, where they can run a bunch of economic models and generate millions and millions of numbers and costs and whatever, this one has trouble actually pulling the numbers out. They can be synthesized. So if we look at what's the content on this, you're going to find this is very lightweight on hard numbers. I had students doing it, when somebody wanted to do the human health chapter, I warned them they did it. There's nothing, there's hardly any content in the human health chapter. It's really sad. There's very little content in the human health chapter about how human health has been damaged by climate today and any estimate of what it might be in the future. Okay, so let's look at the beginning. Again, the structure is nice. I like what they did, but I think they're just struggling for information. It's good because it actually says up front, the assessment is current scientific understanding of the impacts of climate change on natural, managed, and human systems, and the capacity of these systems to adapt and their vulnerability. One sentence says that's what the mandate of the chapter is, of the whole working group, not the chapter. That's what they're trying to do. This is actually a fairly clean definition, and it says up front what to look for, or what they actually live in. So that one is very nice and clean. It's impressively well written, considering the difficulty of pulling all this together. Okay, so that says what they should be reporting on. Sometimes work. So what do we have? Observational evidence. Okay, from all continents and most oceans shows many natural systems being affected by regional climate change, particularly temperature increases. Okay, why particularly temperature increases? Because that's the only thing that's really robust. Other regional climate changes involve warmer, colder, shifts in water supply, you know, but most of the obvious ones globally where you're having big effects are temperature increases. You have some places where you have floods, and other places you have droughts, some places you have more water, less water. There's a lot of patchiness on those small scale things, but the temperature one is the most overall increase, and you see impacts. So what it says is that not the temperature is increasing, but that we take the temperature increases, we use the observed regional temperature increases, now we look at ecosystems and say, are they being impacted by the temperature increase? Working Group 1 has the responsibility of saying, is the temperature increasing, where, how much, globally, whatever. Working Group 2 is now getting down to what does it do? So this now begins natural systems, okay? It's all natural systems to start with, okay? And so we go through everything from natural systems being affected, and we have enlargement, increased number of glacial lakes, okay? What does that mean? Well, it means that you end up having more melting, so you end up visibly seeing more glacial lakes from space because there's more meltwater in the summer, okay? That affects things. We don't know how much, but it certainly affects the local systems, okay? Increasing ground instability and permafrost reasons. Yeah, permafrost melts, the roads fall under, you can't drive on them, the buildings lose their pylons, okay. These are all fairly straightforward. And then we have hydrologic systems and then terrestrial biological systems. So I don't know why they break natural systems, okay, versus, you know, hydrologic systems versus terrestrial biology, but again, it's trying to categorize and pull them together. The other one is, again, the greening of vegetation. The seasonal cycles are changing. It's the most obvious one, where it's the physical seasonal cycle we see in terms of melting of rivers and melting and freezing of rivers. That's obvious. This one has to do with earlier greening. What you'll see is if you do many, many plots, you'll see a statistical distribution where 90% are getting a longer season or greening earlier, and maybe 10% are not. So again, you're trying to pull together enough statistics because a single individual plot can have its own variability. That's one of the arguments about this. We'll see how hard it is to pull together. Let's see, that's just the marine and freshwater biological systems associated with rising water temperature. Okay, that is, there's been, in terms of the marine and freshwater marine systems, the most obvious changes that are sort of uniform, whatever is the temperature rise. It's not necessarily nutrients, it's not necessarily other issues, but the temperature's been the primary one if they look across it, that then they can calibrate. Okay. Now, what's part of working group 2 is that discernible influence on physical and biological systems. Global assessment since 1970, likely anthropogenic warming has had a discernible influence on many physical and biological systems. Well, that anthropogenic warming, discernible and physical, is sort of working group 1 in some sense, and so the key part is physical and biological, and they're not trying to take over physical, but they're saying in some cases they're looking both physical and biological together. It's not separable. But this tends to be small plots, small regions, as opposed to like a global integration of a weather system and climate temperature data. Consistency with observed model changes, studies. Decision include high confidence anthropogenic warming in the last 3 decades has discernible influence on many physical and biological systems. So we have, it's very funny, we have the statement out in bold, then we repeat it again down here. So that's the bold summary statement, and then below we have this other statement here. Effectively, again, discernible influence. That gets back to like 1994 and working group 1, where there was a discernible, human impact there was discernible human influence on climate. That is, the idea that the human impact on climate was discernible, detectable, noticeable. Okay. That goes back to 94, 95, when that statement first came out on the physical climate. Now we're getting to that statement on the small systems and ecosystems and other systems we see here in working group 2. That's a fairly large, hard leap. It takes a lot of work. All right. So one of the questions is, what's really new here? That's one of the questions I had is, since not likely, so if we take that statement as a big thing, what's new? Is it the since 1970? Is it the likely, which has some uncertainty issues to it? Is it the discernible part? Okay. And you can sort of, if you're trying to figure out what they're really new, it's not easy to figure out what's really hot or new about that one. Didn't help. But I would say it's probably biological. The discernible one's also on the edge. Just now you can see the discernible parts of the biology. So the other one they bring up, which is important on this one, is again this issue of adaptation and non-climate drivers. Okay. If you're trying to say it looks like more people in New York are suffering from the heat wave than there were 10 years ago, the problem is what happened to, are there more people in New York? Okay. Have they been adapting? Less people are suffering because more people are getting air conditioning. Okay. Everybody in Paris now probably won't leave their grandmother behind in August unless they have air conditioning in their flats. Otherwise, so grandmother doesn't die in Paris while they're off in the south of France. I'm serious, that's what happened to a lot of people if they were stuck in flats that they couldn't get out of. Okay, so what are the adaptation issues, how people adapted by, okay. Or what are the non-climatic drivers? Water use, fuel use, other issues. And so this makes it difficult to go after looking at regional changes on ecosystems or people systems or whatever and say, oh, it's climate change or whatever. And that's what they're warning you about. And so there is some work. Okay. Again, and then they're trying to pick off things, so human health such as heat-related mortality in Europe and infectious disease vectors. Okay. So this is where you say the effect of temperature has been documented on certain things. Okay. But that doesn't mean that the heat wave in Europe is not, it's only once or twice, it's only one big one, and we have one in Chicago, there aren't that many. So what do you mean by documented in terms of the whole changes? It's still tough. This is this great map here. Now this is an interesting map because it's one of the few things that has numbers in this working group, okay? And what you recognize is that it involves, this is thousands and thousands of scientist years here. This is a map of the temperature underneath, so I gave you the temperature scale below. It's a really weird temperature scale, this blue, green, and funny peachy color, and then whatever. This is the temperature scale. So this is the observed temperature increase. This comes from working group 1, basically, although they adapted it and did their own thing, in the regions that they've got. So it's whether it's getting warmer or colder in different regions, okay? Some areas are getting colder, you can see around Greenland. There should be bigger areas around South America. So these are areas of temperature change. And that's just to make the graph look prettier. The important information is all the little dots everywhere. And the dots then are summarized by a little square box. So for example, for North America, if we could look, and NAM, okay, this was Latin America, there are 355 significant observed changes. There are, in physical systems, there are 455 significant observed changes in biological systems on a small scale regionally. And of them, the percent that's consistent with warming is 94%, 92%. So, it's an odd way to present it, but it's a fair and easy enough way to do it, is that you actually, these are all sort of small plots, regional ecosystem stuff. This is not taken by a satellite or anything else, so these are all small studies, okay? So it literally means somebody's out there for 20 years. Now these have to have been run for how long? I'm trying to remember. These were run since 1970, at least 20 years or more to get on this, okay? So this is like watching something for 20 years, okay? Somebody has to record or come back every 5 years and do it, okay? And now you say, okay, we go to San Jacinto and we see slowly a change as as the pines disappear, okay? Then you say, okay, is that consistent with warming? You say, yes. Did it warm there? So the question is, do you have to know whether it warmed there, or is it consistent with warming? So is it consistent in general with warming? You say, yes. In other cases, it was not. Then you go to Latin America and you see, what, 53 studies, the physical one, which are really easy to observe. Biological studies are a real pain. That's a lot of work, basically, to observe ecosystems, much harder than physical systems. Okay, 5 studies. Then you go to Europe, and there are 28,000 plots and things and studies where people have done the biological systems. Europe is well populated, okay, and so on. So you get a feeling of whether or not it's consistent. So this is the best they've got for change on small scales, ecosystems, regional, whatever, citywide, being consistent with change. So here's the whole figure. Again, period is 1970 to 2004, so you have to have fairly long records for these things. Okay, and as you can see, Europe is heavily dotted, and you see most of the other places have hardly any representation. Oh, a lot of northwestern U.S. because of forestries, national parks, the mountains, and the tree. Basically, the Sierras. There's a lot of work being done on how those are changing, but there's not a lot in middle of the U.S. in the southeast. So this is, in some sense, the sum of the data sets. You can see a lot of places are totally not represented on these studies. Okay, but that's about what you got. Why is painstaking? Somebody had the insight in the 70s and 80s to set up these sites, observe, record, keep going, okay, and then rotate. This is painful stuff. Okay. Key findings regarding projected impacts of finding vulnerability, more specific impact now available across a wide range of spectrum, okay. Drought-affected areas will increase, heavy precip. This is like working group 1, sort of warning what to affect. But this one we get to 20%, 20-30% of plant and animal species assessed so far likely increased risk of extinction if increases at global temperature exceed something. Now we get something sort of hard-nosed that's out there that's saying we're going to have 30% extinction if we go to 2.5 degrees, okay? Now, what does risk of extinction mean? I don't know that. I'm not a working group 2 person. I don't know what they mean by, 20% of plant species are at increased risk of extinction. Now that doesn't mean they're going to become extinct. They're at increased risk. So what does that mean? They know what they're doing. They're very careful wording, but you're going to have to look up that one if you want to figure out what exactly it means. Because literally you say, okay, everybody's at risk of extinction at some point. You say, no. So somebody has to be at some level of risk of extinction. Now, did it increase because of what they've seen happen? So it's fairly tough to do. And once again, crop productivity, slightly increased mid to high latitudes, decreased beyond that. So again, they're looking at the range of what happens for different temperature ranges. Generally, people agree that the first ½ degree to degree of warming, which we're already at almost 1 degree of warming now, basically benefits the agriculture at the mid and high latitudes and basically destroys it in the tropics and continues to destroy in the tropics. So even if the total global increases for the next 50 years, you have major dislocations and you have excess food in some countries and total starvation in others. So you have a problem with distribution. We've already seen it's not easy to distribute food. So this crop productivity, again, potential for food production, expected increase and so on. So this is sort of the big issues. If these get hardened and these become more realistic and more quantitative, and saying which countries where, whatever, this is what the countries want by region. Okay, but these are the big ones. Increase in drought and flood, adaptation of altered cultivars, loss in timing. Again, they're looking at what are the issues on adapting to floods, okay. They're going to affect crop production, cultivars, okay. Commercial timber is another big issue, okay. Expected to rise for a while, okay. So again, they're looking at all the various big crops, money makers, economy things, okay, in this section. Regional changes, particular fish species, I know, expected to continue warming, adverse effects for aquaculture and fisheries. Aquaculture is sort of locked into some regions, so then you have to readapt. Again, they're looking at, again, all of these issues about what's going to happen, what's happened in the last 20, 30 years, and what they expect to project. Coastal systems are highly vulnerable, so we get the coastal wetlands, we get the corals, okay, and flooding. So it reminds you that what the problem with coastal systems. We then merge into working group 2. Every once in a while wanders into the issues of equity and ethics. Okay, and it's a different problem, but it's still sort of within, they view that as within their domain. Adaptation costs more challenging in developing countries than developed due to constraints on adaptive capacity. This is a delicate issue because you're actually saying that the developing countries don't have any adaptive capacity and they're poorly off. And people will say, yeah, we are poorly off, but we're not that poorly off. So this is sort of like, how dare you, at what level do you insult the poor countries you know you don't have adaptive capacity? So, but again, it's bringing up sort of all sorts of delicate issues that some countries are really so poor they can't adapt to anything. And so when small things happen, what's going to happen? What will happen to the economy or basically the government? Again, particularly vulnerable in those areas, high-risk areas, and have more limited capacities. Again, these are sort of these are highly charged statements, and they got through the government. So this went through a government plenary. The government's agreed to this, and it's not just the scientists writing it. And some of them maybe even wanted it in there, but this is still, this is a high issue of sort of danger. Health issues, again, it talks about who, what, where, if they can talk about it, cardiovascular disease, and so on. Okay. Then they come up with statements that got me. I put my own question mark in there. I've read this several times. More specific information now available across the regions of the world concerning the nature of future impacts, including for some places not covered in previous assessments. Now this is a bullet. This is a take-home message. And I don't know what the heck to get out of that take-home message. It says a statement that we know, there's more information about things. I mean, that's very useful, but I don't know why that's a headline in the newspaper, okay? You think about it. So every once in a while these things slip in, and I think they didn't know what to say there, but they had to say something. They had to have a bullet in front of this next section, which will go by region in Africa. You'll see coming up the next regions. They had to do something, but every once in a while I read that and I go, what am I, why is that even bothering? It's a waste of words. Okay, we then go country by country. So Africa, you highlight things. Africa's supposed to be the most vulnerable. Again, quote, multiple stresses, low adaptive capacity. So you start seeing words, what's the adaptive capacity? What are the stresses? This is sort of classic working group 2 talk. Asia, glacial melt in Himalayas projected to increase flooding. It also may make it harder to have record water supply issues too. That's one of the projections here. Whether that was the famous Himalayan glacier that was a mistake, I don't know. It might have been. But I think probably increased melt is one thing. The statement that the glacier was going to disappear by 2035 was a mistake. That was the one that sort of flaps in the last year where somebody got in there by accident. And it turned out, it was really weird. They actually, Working Group 2 quoted like a World Wildlife Fund site, not a scientific publication where they got it from, something like that. And then it's crept in further. And then the chairman of the IPCC doesn't pay attention and quoted it and backed it up saying, of course, this is real, because he's not a climate scientist. He's an economist, sort of engineer type person. Anyhow, so it got even worse because people kept pushing and they finally realized, oops, no. So that was where the glacier melt went. But I think this one is a little more general. It says we are going to have increased melting. Endemic morbidity and mortality due to diarrheal disease, it gets even worse, okay. Australia and New Zealand, water security issues, okay. Southern Australia and New Zealand, rainfall issues, okay. Biodiversity is going to change. I'm really going to stress the sort of climate regimes, Africa, New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand. Southern Europe has their problem, okay, climate change worse. The Caribbean's going to get hotter and drier, that region, Southern Europe. And yet they expect summer precip to decrease in Central and Eastern Europe, but then they talk about flooding elsewhere. But again, the predictions of changes in the water supply places from Working Group 1 is not that hard. So Working Group 2 is tough. They're going to say, okay, given this mean average, if this is projected, what's going to happen? But they don't have that much hard numbers because right now the ability to predict what's going to happen to where the rain will fall, it's not that good. North America, again, Western mountains, snowpack issues, that's a big issue. We need snowpack to hold the water so it doesn't come all down. Winter flooding issues, reduce summer flows. Pest fires and whatever, that's again a major Western issue. There's not a lot of talk about the East Coast and Southeast under climate change, which is probably not have some other problems of their own. Polar regions, small island states gets theirs, okay. So everybody has their own region that gets brought up. Then we move on to the future, okay. What's going to happen? This is all, what current threats are, then you go on to what's going to happen. We estimate more systematically for possible increase in global average temperature. Well, this says that Working Group 2, assuming Working Group 1 delivers the right projections, you now have a better way to estimate, we now have a better way to say what happens in a warmer world. So this is actually saying there have been more studies, more mechanistic studies, more modeling studies that we can actually project what's going to happen on these things. So, one of the things that starts coming up is key vulnerabilities. Great catchword, okay. Depending on circumstances, something that can be associated with key vulnerabilities based on things, okay. So that's what is a key vulnerability? It's sort of what everybody thinks are various definitions of it, okay. It means being at risk plus being unable to fix it if, zero adaptive capacity and being threatened by 1 centimeter rise, that's sort of vulnerability. Okay. Okay. So this one is, again, I put in my question, what is a key vulnerability? If you're reading this, it's sort of hard. Is it a large climate shift? Is it rapid? Is it Greenland melting? It's it's hard to tell what they mean in general. It's the bottom part. You know, it's things you have low adaptive capacity and uneven adjustment. They could include the top one. It's climate shifts, it's temperature, it's sea level rise, but the real issue is how you adapt to it makes the vulnerability. Chapter 19 was written by Steve Schneider, who unfortunately died this year. And Russian Semenov and Poronin were the lead authors. Chapter 19 took off on its own. It's responsible for a lot of the key vulnerabilities. Chapter 19 got in trouble with a lot of the reviewers and the governments because it basically started on its own definition of what it wanted to do. It created a thing that it sort of created its own science genre within the chapter and was not exactly referenced in the literature. And went forward, it's the logical thing, it's reasonable, but it was really sort of a personal vision rather than an assessment of the literature. And so it went forward with its own idea of what should be, how do we define key vulnerabilities, how should we do them, and it got in trouble. It was one of the only chapters almost was not accepted. The governments almost were going to make a fight to say we will not accept chapter 19. There'll be a hole in the document. Don't forget, they don't approve the chapters, they accept them. And if they said it didn't respond to the reviews, the government reviews, and it still was policy oriented, then they would say no. And it came very close. So a lot of this chapter 19 thing gets into issues, many of the impacts, vulnerabilities, risks, what are the characteristics that might make them key, and if it's key, what might, And so this was trying to identify, so here we have, chapter identifies 7 criteria used to identify key vulnerabilities, their own definition from scratch. Okay, it's never been done before, really. Okay, magnitude of impacts, timing of impacts, persistence, likelihood, associated with climate sensitivity, including food supply, okay. So it's sort of setting up this whole new concept, which is why I got in trouble. Anyhow, so back to page 16, that's why that one little blurb in there. This is the other big figure we have. It's this great one of, sorry, now you can read it. We have water ecosystems, food, and so on. And then we have what happens to water availability, does it get better or worse? We have these solid lines and dashed lines. And so ecosystems, the upper one says up to 30% extinction species at increasing risk of extinction, which we read earlier, at around 2 degrees. And then if you get to 4 to 5, it says significant extinctions around the globe. Okay, so all these, again, fairly qualitative. The numbers 0 to 5 are hard. We're already about 1. And so this talks about when you start seeing things happen. So from a point of view of a qualitative assessment, it's a reasonable figure. When do things come online that you start worrying about? And so it brings them up under the appropriate categories. It's fairly soft, okay? It's based on some level of, fairly subjective probably level, pulling them together. But the bits and pieces are in the chapters. Okay. So this is sort of the best they can do. It's the numbers on the right tell you where to find it in the chapters, 3.4, 1.3, and so on, the chapter references, which is good, because otherwise it's really soft. So it says, look at this subsection of this chapter, which is very useful, because at least you can find it. So this is sort of their big take-home. The other one is what's happening. This is probably the biggest take-home from the chapter, and it's so they're one big figure. We have, has there been changed impacts due to altered frequencies and intensity of extreme weather, climate, and sea level are very likely to change? This is an odd statement because it's not really their statement. It's working group 1. They don't really know whether extreme weather and climate and sea level events are going to change, because it's not really their predictive capability. And it's a very strange one because it doesn't say has there been change already, it just says they're very likely to change. And so once again, this is just the forward-looking what's going to happen in the future. I don't know who writes this, but this one should never get made out because it's sort of an odd prediction, which is not necessarily backed up by working group 1 forecast, sort of forecasting future climate. It's sort of this odd statement, but that's to justify, I think, it's really more a chapeau to say what's next. Now we're going to say what's going to happen with these events. Change. And so you have some climate potential cause large impacts, especially after the 21st century. That's working group 2. That's the key issue. If something happens that's large enough, it's been sort of projected post-21st century, what's going to be the impact? They're large, okay. Sea level rises. We have on sea level. We have the meridional overturning circulation, but they admit that's not going to do much. Okay, that's been a long thing working group 1. Impacts of climate change will vary regionally, with aggregate discount at the present. They are likely to impose net annual cost increase over time as global temperature increases. That actually is a fairly large integrated result, if they did it right, is they're literally trying to integrate timescales, costs, levers. Now they're putting together saying, okay, collectively, how much does this cost us? So that was a fairly tough statement to make, a fairly important one to back up. That's really integrative, more than just field studies. Okay, this is again impact. They're trying to average over. It's that big figure. What do you expect for different warmings? And now we end up with the social cost of carbon. And it's, again, working group 2 should tell you what carbon costs. That's what they're trying to do in this. They're not the economists, but they're trying to do cost-effective damages that have been done, and then say effectively what a ton of carbon does for damage. So that's, they're introducing this. This didn't get a lot of press, the social cost of carbon. I haven't seen many articles on it or whatever, but it's sort of one of their big attempts. This big table is the last table they have, or figure, and it just goes section by section. So it says phenomena and direction. They have a thing, they said likelihood that the trend's going to be virtually certain that we're still going to have warmer, fewer cold days and nights. Okay. Then they go into ag, forestry, and so on, human health, what the impacts are likely to be. So this is more qualitative, but it has a little more meat on it for things to look for. So they're going to list the most important things that, for example, was it fewer cold days and nights and warmer and more frequent hot days and nights. What that does to water resources, what that does to this. And then the middle one, and highlighted, virtually certain is that going to happen, yes. So we go through various things. This is warm spells, heavy precip events. Let's see, drought increases, intense tropical cyclone activity increases, likely. If you look at working group 1, it doesn't quite say that. Because they got very nervous. Different models. This is another one as to whether it does, and then again the consequences of tropical cyclones, everyone wants that one. Extreme high seas, okay, excluding tsunamis and so on. And so that's sort of the justification for that big color bar, for that table there as to what's of interest, and they can fill in a little more, not quantitative, they can fill more detail than they could in that little bar chart. Current knowledge about responding, adaptationally necessary, yes. And now what's looking at, the one I have whoops on this one, this is the classic disconnect between working group 1 and 2. Adaptation necessary from the warming which is already unavoidable due to past emissions. And then they quote that past emissions have an additional 0.6 degrees, okay? This is a case of working group 2 misreading working group 1 and working group 1 getting what they deserve, okay? What were those commitment model calculations? Working group 1 did these silly calculations they called commitment, okay? That little fuzzy orange line on that future line, and that got an additional 0.6 of a degree. What did they do? To do the commitment experiments, all radiative forcing agents were held constant, okay? That is not zeroing emissions. It is not constant emissions. It is some obscure history of emissions to hold methane, CO2, N2O, and aerosols constant. That is a very complex emission history, which is required, okay? And it is not previous history of emissions. It involves future emissions. And working group 1 should never have done that calculation because working group 2 didn't even know what they were doing and misquoted it. I find it truly embarrassing that no one caught this in the review. I didn't review working group 2, I reviewed working group 1. I didn't bother reviewing 2. Had I done it, I would have said, guys, this is the wrong statement. But nobody even pays attention to it. So there is still a disconnect. Part of it has to do with the chairs themselves couldn't stand each other. The 3 co-chairs of all working groups hated each other this last time. They wouldn't talk to each other. There was no connections, intentionally, okay? So it really wasn't a very coordinated thing. And so effectively somebody misread it, put that silly thing in. See, past emissions, even if atmospheric concentrations remain. Now, to maintain atmospheric concentrations, you have to do emissions. And so there's a very, and it is important. It's actually an important realization that that calculation includes future emissions, which is an important thing not to forget. It doesn't mean your past emissions. And so that's why that commitment calculation is a very complicated one, and socially it's really it. Anyhow, a wide array of adaptation options possible. They're worrying about this one. Okay, let's sit through this. Vulnerability to climate change can be exacerbated by the presence of other stresses. This is this multi-stressors issue. It's a sustainability issue. If you're trying to adapt to climate, you have other problems often. Depends on climate, but on development pathway. This is, again, a mantra from the Framework Convention for Sustainability, both the convention itself. And then you see working group 2 is the one that deals with these problems. Sustainable development can reduce vulnerability to climate change. This is an important statement. If you believe it, they try to back it up. This is an important chapter on working on the facts of it, is that a more sustainable development tends to actually reduce vulnerability to climate change as well as often reduce climate change itself in emissions. Okay? So this is this issue of the adaptation pathways to climate should not be separated from other adaptation issues. Okay. Many impacts can be avoided, reduced, or delayed by mitigation. They're reminding you not to give up. You're going to have to adapt no matter what, but you should better mitigate also. This is the whole balance. We said, oh, if you're just telling people to adapt, then they won't bother reducing CO2 emissions, but the point is, no, you really have to do both. It's a reminder. And then again, a portfolio of measures diminishes the risks. So the idea, if you mix the two, you can probably optimize combination adaptation and mitigation issues. And that it's not, there have not been a lot of studies on this one, but that's got to be the key one, is how do you balance them? Finally, they end with what I call scientific begging, which we didn't do in Working Group 1, thank God. You know, further observations and research needed. Okay, number of judgments for further observation. This should be considered seriously. Yes, it's a research begging, which I'm surprised they did. It's really embarrassing when you're doing scientific assessment to say, yeah, and send more money. It's one thing to say, here are the things we don't understand, that you should say. But you shouldn't say, send more money and we'll find out. That's sort of a little bit tacky. Then we have our boxes, okay. So that's basically Working Group 2. If you go down to the technical summary, you can see the technical summary is in brown instead of blue. Again, a similar thing. The technical summary starts on page 23 in the document, okay. And it plugs along and you get some other figures. It's fairly detailed, looks similar. Technical summary has all this stuff in it. But that's, it still takes. But the technical summary has other figures like this one. So the technical summary, you can dig out some more interesting figures on climate change, greening, and whatever else. You'll see if you go to the technical summary, you'll find a little more hard-nosed pieces that didn't make it up. So this has to do with greening and temperature issues. This one I get, this one's a fun one, I forget this one. This one was, again, changes in precip and temperature by region. It's quite interesting figure from the depths. This is from the technical summary and from the chapters that didn't make it up. So there's some really more interesting stuff in the technical summary, whereas the summary for policymakers ended up being fairly blah. Okay. There's this figure, which I love. I can't forget this. This is sort of stabilization at different levels and different temperature ranges and whatever, and what happens under different scenarios. This one was the wild one that didn't make it up. Okay. More details on by region. This is the temperature cost by region. This did not make it up for some reason. They didn't like this one. They did it by ecosystem or whatever. This one is by region as to what the damage is. This is sort of the increasing temperature by region, which is an interesting one. So you'll find the technical summary a lot more stuff than made it up, which is somewhat frustrating. Okay, more words made it up, not a lot of facts. This is the crop yield reduction by temperature. These are different crop patterns. This is sort of crop yield reduction by temperature. So you can see whether or not what the noise is in the system. It's quite interesting. So anyhow, if you want to find it, the technical summary is worth looking at if you want to start getting more ideas, some details about what Working Group 2 science really is about without going to all the chapters. The technical summary would be a good way to go see what do they really do, what are they out there measuring. Okay. Whereas the SPM, I think, was fairly lightweight and somewhat boring, but it reminds you they have a problem. They have to go from regional climate change, ecosystems, human systems, then equity, then costs, then how do we do adaptation and mitigation. The responsibility of this is far tougher. Working Group has it relatively easy. Good. So, a little late, not late, but a little late for questions, so anyhow, thoughts on whatever. Next week will be Diane Pataki, I think on biodiversity and other things. Is that, what's the title? Is it biodiversity issues?
Biodiversity.
Yeah, okay. And then the following week?
You are indeed.
Donald Dapp of the bum, okay. Then I'll do Working Group 3 the following week, sorry. I was trying to put it off till much later. Okay. You'll get transportation, urban systems later. This is small. Again, if you look at sort of the scale of the body of work and people work in this area, it's huge. If you look at how painful it is to get the data sets in. You know, one person can spend their life doing 2 or 3 plots in Southern California, monitoring, doing the science out, and it gets 1 point out of something. That's sort of what it takes to do the regional stuff. And then you look at the fact that many places are just unrepresented entirely. So that's the whole issue about Africa, small islands, and whatever. There's really not enough local studies on the impact of how the current climate change is driving it, and then trying to extrapolate from the mechanism of what might happen. So, any thoughts? You ready to become a Working Group 2 scientist? If you really want to read Working Group, it's a tough report to read. It's a tough one to write. But it really gets to the heart of the matter more than Working Group 3. Working Group 3 is just, what's the cost? How much can we save? We make buildings more efficient. At an extra $20, how much carbon do we save? So it's very interesting. But this one really is much more to the core of the whole thing. And so I think it's always going to be one of the toughest working groups. And if you look at the outline, it's expanded even more this year. I just looked at the number of lead authors. The number of lead authors in Working Group 1 is probably, my guess, might be around 70 or something. I think working group 2 is like 150. Just because, 20-some chapters, the regional chapters, it's just really difficult. Good.
Yeah, a question not related to this lecture, but sorry. There's an EPA proposal that's due December 22nd for like interdisciplinary teams working on basically on issues of sustainability.
Yeah.
And
okay.
we had discussed applying for that, and we were wondering if that's okay to do or not.
Well, okay. It's certainly okay to do. What I don't know whether is, you're cursed if you get it, or it wouldn't qualify for the applications. The question is often that's meant for faculty. So first of all, you don't have PI status, okay? So to get a proposal out the door of the university, you have to have PI status. Okay, so I can cover for you, fine. But effectively, you need somebody. So you either have to be faculty or a research series, okay, to write a proposal out here. You can write fellowship proposals out here. They always make exceptions for that one. So if this were an EPA fellowship proposal, that'd be no-brainer, okay.
Okay.
Second of all, EPA is really not a very good taskmaster. They're as annoying as the FAA and other places. They often are, I mean, some people do it, but like, they're really annoying taskmasters for quarterly reports and doing things and whatever. And so now the question would also be, for this one more importantly, I mean, that's my personal dealing with EPA, that's annoying, but now the question is, what level of support would you ask for? What would it be doing it for? So you have to propose a budget. Okay. And would it be, I'm just wondering what they're looking for, because I think I remember seeing that go by. And my view is they're hunting for either people in different campuses even, or people in different departments. It was meant to be sort of a multidisciplinary. I think it was supposed to involve. Now, the question is whether or not they would consider your proposal more of what you could ask for that would be relevant.
Right.
So, if 5 of you get a proposal for, $200,000 a year, what are you going to do with it? Okay. You have to spend it legally and appropriately. I'm sorry, you can't just divide up the money. I've thought about that myself, but it doesn't work that way. So the issue is, what budget would you propose to do such a thing?
Okay.
Okay. And so I would look more at the requirements on it to see, does it even fit within your project?
Okay.
If it does, we should go for it and do it. I'm not against doing it, but I'm warning you that often those things, you start reading what are the requirements. What are the requirements for the PI, who's doing what? You start going, oh, this probably is, something you do maybe 3 years from now, 4 years from now. Out there, it's not necessarily something you want to do as a graduate.
Okay.
But, so, prod me, send me the link, remind me to go look it up. You should also look it up. I mean, it'd be great to do, it'd be fun to do. It's also be fun to write the proposal, but again, I'm not sure what they're after.
Okay.
And I'd be,
Okay, we'll look at it again and send the link to you.
But good idea, it'd be fun to do it. But I'm just sort of worried because most of those proposals, they're looking for, somebody in math, somebody in statistics, somebody in computer science doing, and then somebody else doing it. So they say, okay, we have this interdisciplinary team, they're going to go attack this problem. And so they're looking to support, 5 graduate students, but not necessarily directly.
Okay.
So if it works, we should try it. The other one is that it's, depends on how much work it is. If it doesn't too much work, and it's legal, then we should submit the proposal for the fun of doing it.
Yeah.
Okay. But it might be an awful lot of work to get the proposal out, because you may have to do all sorts of certification issues on you, who's PI, who's not PI, who's certifying this. There are all sorts of legal things. When I write a proposal, it costs our MSO, our administrative people, probably 2 days worth of work or more, doing all the budget stuff and everything else. Okay. So in that sense, it depends on how serious the budget is and whatever. And you should also, they might say how many awards and how much money. And so if it starts looking like $1 million award, I wouldn't bother doing it, because I think then they're going to ask for an awful lot of stuff to go with it. If it starts looking for small amounts of awards, then you say, okay, maybe we fit. So that'd be my only recommendation, but certainly try. The other thing is to look for the fellowship supports. They'd be also, I mean, this is more of a fellowship activity. If we can get fellowship money in, more straightforward, and also graduate students can usually apply directly for fellowships. So if you see something you do for fellowships, then usually you can get permission. The university will give you PI for fellowship proposals. You don't have to cover for them. I mean, you need a faculty advisor to back up, but they mostly go in from the students. So
If you see fellowship things related to this, those are definitely worth trying for. I mean, that's, you're competitive, you might look really good, you can do it as a group, you might try it as a group or not, I don't know, we'll see what the rules are. But either way, that would be fine. If it's a major PI one, then I have a feeling that there's just going to be an awful lot of painful work to do to document, what is the facilities doing, which are computational facilities, which, you have to write all this stuff up in a proposal that documents how you're going to support the research. But if it isn't too onerous, then it's good practice. As long as it doesn't divert you, from other stuff. So. Good. Excellent. Okay. Any other things? Sorry about working group 2. It's not as concrete as working group 1. It's sort of frustrating.